Hi folks, HR Funk here. With my recently acquired CZ P09C Nocturne pistol, if you saw my recent review on this handgun, you know that I mentioned part of the reason that I acquired it had to do with a question that I was asked recently during a live stream. And the question was, does the DA first and SA successive shot trigger system still have a place for the modern defensive shooter? And I think it does. And I mentioned during that video review that I would address that question in a later video, and this is now the later video. And with the handguns that have a double action first trigger pull with a single action pull for each successive shot, the biggest benefit has to do with safety. Now, the one that we're probably most acquainted with, and I hear this periodically, is for folks that like pistols just like this that have an exposed hammer, and they like to carry their handgun appendix inside the waistband because when they're holstering it, they can place their thumb over top of the hammer, and as they're guiding the pistol into the holster, they can make sure that the trigger doesn't engage anything that's going to cause it to cycle and discharge around. If the trigger is influenced by anything as they are placing it in the holster, the hammer cannot move, so there is a measure of safety there for that reholstering activity. Beyond that, you don't have to look too hard either on YouTube or other sources to see people under certain circumstances who squeeze off a shot when they don't intend to. I don't know that I've seen that happen with a double action trigger system, to include double action revolvers for that matter, but I've definitely seen it with the so-called safe action, double action only, single action, pre-cocked action. There are a lot of names for very similar triggers that essentially have a short, relatively light trigger pull before the weapon discharges. With the double action first shot, for someone who is under stress and they come up on a target and they have their finger inside the trigger guard, it takes a little bit more positive action to actually cause that firearm to discharge than you have with some of the other trigger systems that are out there and are very popular. Back during the 1990s and prior to that, a lot of the handguns that we had trigger systems very similar to the CZ P09C Nocturne, although they did not have a polymer frame. This is one of the few polymer frame hammer-fired handguns on the market today. In fact, I think the HK P30 might be the only other one. I'm not sure. But the big concern with the double action first shot and single action for each successive shot trigger system is that someone is not going to be able to fire it fast enough to get an accurate shot on target, and then that shooter has to manage the second trigger pull when they transition from the double action pull to the single action pull before they fire the next shot. Now again, this is something we had to do back in the day, and it was not all that difficult to master, at least I didn't think so. But I thought it might be kind of fun to put together a test with handguns like this that have a double action first pull, single action for each pull after that trigger system, and some of the other trigger systems that are basically the generic polyframe striker-fired handguns that everyone is used to that have been very, very popular for the last several decades. So I'm going to show you a close-up look at the handguns I'm going to use for this test, then I'll tell you about the test that I'm going to conduct. Here are the pistols I'm going to be using for this test, and there is method to my madness with the selection of these specific handguns. What I'm trying to do is keep them as close as I can to each other design-wise, with the big difference being the fact that some of them have a double action for the first shot and single action for each successive shot trigger system, and others have the so-called safe action, or what I'll call the generic Glock style trigger. And in this first pairing, I'm going to be trying to give the Glock style trigger every advantage, and what I have is the Daria Island pistol. So not only does this have a trigger that a lot of people think are better than the average Glock, in fact I think this is a little better than the average Glock, but it also has a multi-ported barrel. It has an optic mounted to it, so if there is a handgun that's really going to stand out from the crowd due to its trigger system in this test, it should be this pistol because it has a lot of other attributes as well. Going head-to-head against the Daria Island pistol is going to be the Walther P99AS, And these two handguns have a lot of similarities. If you look at them, you can see that the grip is somewhat similar. The frame has a similar projection along the side for a thumbs forward hold. Obviously, they're both chambered for the 9mm Parabellum cartridge. They both feed from double column magazines. And the big difference between these two handguns is the fact that the P99 has a double action pull for the first shot and a single action pull for each successive shot. And this is one of the few Poly Striker fired handguns that actually ever use that design. In fact, off the top of my head, I can't think of another one. The other big advantage that the Island pistol is going to have is there is an optic mounted to it, whereas the P99 is going to be using just the iron sights. So this should be really interesting to see just how well the P99 fares against the Derya Island pistol. On the other side of the mat is the Ruger RXM, which once again has the generic Glock trigger. Now, some people think this trigger feels better than the average Glock. I really think it just feels like the average Glock trigger, truthfully. There are no ports on this barrel, but this is a match barrel. Once again, I do have an optic that is mounted to this pistol, but this time around, the pistol that's going head-to-head with it is also going to have an optic. No match barrel. This is the CZ P09C Nocturne, but it does have the double action trigger for the first shot and a single action pull for each successive shot. Just like I said before, both of these are chambered for the 9mm Parabellum cartridge. They both feed from a double column magazine, and they have similar frame features, not identical, but similar. So as I said, I'm trying to keep these handguns as close as I can to each other than the trigger system, and of course, as I said, the optic being mounted to the Island pistol, whereas the P99 AS is going to be using just the iron sights. But I think it will be kind of cool to see just exactly where all of these handguns end up as I work my way through this test. If you're still thinking to yourself, this is silly, why would anyone want a defensive handgun that has a longer, heavier trigger and takes more work to master rather than one that has a shorter, lighter trigger and it's easier to shoot, particularly easier to shoot quickly? There are times that shooting quickly can have consequences. And I have heard this story more than once where someone wakes up in the middle of the night, they're not completely awake, and they find someone in their home believing they are confronting an intruder. They fire a shot only to find out later on they actually shot a family member or at least another resident of that home. Obviously, that is tragic, and if this trigger pull can reduce the possibility of that happening as opposed to this trigger pull, which obviously is much quicker and easier to fire a shot, that is a consideration. Beyond that, imagine having a group of young police officer candidates or military recruits or what have you, and you are teaching them to shoot a handgun. You've got them all on the firing line for the very first time, and they have to deal with this trigger pull as opposed to this trigger pull. Which one, as a firearms instructor, would make you feel safer? Obviously, at least for me, this would make me feel a little bit safer than this, even though I know it's going to take a little bit of additional work to get those shooters up to speed with this trigger system as opposed to this one. And as I said during the opening, there have been videos of people who presumably were trained with handguns in high-stress situations who managed to crank off a shot when they didn't intend to. It is less likely to occur with that long, heavy double-action trigger pull than it is with the very short, light trigger pull. When I get to the range, I will be using a target that looks just like this and firing several defensive drills. Those drills will be initiated with my shot timer, and when the bullets strike the target, the scoring will be as follows. Any shots to the body that strike inside of this center square or on the heart will receive 3 points. Anything off the center square or off the heart but inside of this larger square will receive 2 points. Anything off the larger square but on the silhouette otherwise will receive 1 point, and anything completely off the silhouette receives 0 points. For shots that are intentionally fired at the head, anything that strikes this center brain area to include this portion of the spinal column receives 3 points. Anything off the center brain but inside of this circle receives 2 points. Anything outside of the circle but on the head otherwise receives 1 point, and anything completely off the head receives 0 points. Now, for shots that strike the line of the next higher scoring value, for example, something that strikes in this area but breaks the line of the heart, that will receive 3 points. If something is out here but breaks the line of this larger square, it receives 2 points. So anything that breaks a line always gets the score of the higher value. As I said, these drills are going to be initiated with my shot timer, and I will keep track of the elapsed time that's necessary to fire each shot for every drill. When I get done, I will subtract that time from the numeric score that that handgun received on that drill, thereby using the time as a penalty. I explained before why I do this. There is a reason for it. I do not use the score divided by time that's typically used in competition, because that tends to favor firing quickly as opposed to firing accurately. I think this is a better system to use for a defensive shooter, because the defensive shooter always has to be concerned with accuracy first. Time is a consideration, but accuracy is the foremost priority. In any case, when we get done, I will look at all the adjusted times with the numeric score minus the elapsed time, and we'll figure out how these handguns performed in all the drills. All right, folks, I've arrived out on the range, and in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to start to shoot my way through some drills so we can see just how much difference there might be in the performance of these handguns. But before I do, I want to make a couple of comments just to clarify what you're about to see. First off, the drills that I've devised are meant to isolate the influence of the trigger system when it comes to getting fast and accurate shots on target. So I'm going to be looking at how much influence there is in the ability to do that between the double action first pull, single action second pull trigger system, and what I'll generically call the Glock style trigger, which, as I said earlier, has various names, safe action and what have you, but essentially the same trigger pull for each and every shot. For that reason, the drills are not going to feature more than 2 consecutive shots each time I perform them. Reason being, I'm looking at the double action first trigger pull and then the trigger transition, and once that's complete, any shots that I fire subsequent to that really are only testing the single action trigger of this type of handgun with the safe action, double action only, whatever, of the Glock style triggers. Now, if there's interest in that, maybe I'll do it later on, but I'm not looking at that in this video. Another thing I want to point out, because if I don't say this, people will come into the comment section and be all over me and tell me about how there are ways around having to fire your first shot double action with a handgun like the P09C. For example, one of the big ones you see a lot of times is people will talk about thumb cocking the hammer first before you fire the first shot. There are other, even more extreme measures for trying to get around firing that first shot double action, and I don't think any of them are particularly safe or tactically sound, so I'm not going to be doing that. I also know that there are mechanical ways with both the P09C and the P99AS for essentially avoiding the long, heavy double action pull. For example, with the P09C, it can be converted to a safety that would allow the handgun to be carried cocked and locked, and then in order to fire it, the safety would have to be physically disengaged before firing the first shot, which would be a single action shot. I realize that. I'm not testing that. There's no reason to tell me about it in the comment section. With the P99AS, it can be put into a mode where that first trigger pull is essentially a long but very light trigger pull. I know that that's not what I'm testing, so that's not what I'm going to be doing with that pistol. So I wanted to get that out of the way now. I'll explain each drill when I get to it and let you know what it is exactly that I'm going to be doing. There are going to be multiple repetitions of some of these drills, so at the end I'll be looking at the times, I'll be looking at the scores, and we'll see what the standings end up being in the overall test. So here we go. The first drill is going to be fired from a distance of 5 yards, and in this drill I'm going to start from a ready position, and on signal from my shot timer I'm going to come up, and as fast as I think I accurately can, I'm going to fire one shot to the head. This drill simulates a situation where the defensive shooter already has a hostile adversary who is very close or who is converging rapidly, and that shooter has to try to get one decisive shot on target as quickly as possible. I'm going to start things off with the Daria Island pistol. Let's see how it goes. .31, 1.31 seconds. .22, 1.22 seconds. .07 seconds. Next up is the Walther P90 AS. Once again, this pistol is going to be fired every time. First shot, double action, and then any shots after that obviously will be single action. I'll be decocking it after every drill just to make sure that it starts out in that double action mode. And as I said back in the shop, I'm going to be shooting this with the mechanical sights. So let's see how this goes. .12 seconds, 1.12. .24, 1.24. And 1.05. On we go to the P09C Nocturne. This is the newest pistol in my collection. I've only had it for a week or so at this point. This is also the second handgun that features the double action first shot, single action second shot. I'm still getting acquainted with this handgun, so let's see how it does in these drills. .22 seconds, 1.22. .05 seconds, 1.05. And 1.08. Batting cleanup will be the Ruger RXM. As I said back in the shop, this handgun has a trigger that is very, very similar to your average Glock. Let's see how it does in these drills. .09, 1.09. .98, 0.98. And 1.14. Drill number 2 is going to be fired from a distance of 7 yards, and this is going to be a modified failure drill. Typically, the failure drill requires 2 shots to the body and 1 shot to the head. This time around, it's going to be 1 shot to the body and then 1 shot to the head. Obviously, with the DA SA pistols, this is going to require the shooter to manage that double action trigger pull for the first shot to the body, and then while changing points of aim, transition the trigger to that single action pull and fire an accurate shot to the head. Once again, I'm going to be starting with the Daria Island pistol. Let's see what happens. .49 seconds, 1.49 seconds. .37 seconds, 1.37 seconds. And 1.71 seconds. 1.86, 1.86. 1.75, 1.75. Ooh, pulled that one high. 1.70. 2.11, 2.11. 1.85, 1.85. 2.09. 1.78, 1.78. 1.70, 1.70. Ooh, and I don't think that one's going to count. I think I put that one over the top. Actually, that shot is going to count, but just barely. It just broke the line, so it will count for 1 point. And this is one of the dangers with the failure drill if you're not careful. It's easy when you're making the transition from the body shot to the head shot. If you see your sight picture, but the pistol is still drifting upward and you touch off the shot, this is where they go. So that's exactly what I did. That's on me, bad shot. Now, fortunately, everything else is looking very good. These are all 3-point shots. Down here in the body, these are 2 good 3-point shots. That is only going to count, however, as 1 point. Drill number 3 is going to be fired from a distance of 15 yards. From here, I'm going to be firing 2 shots to the body as fast as I think I can accurately place those shots. Once again, I'm going to be starting with the Derya DY9 Island pistol. .01, 2.01. 1.80, 1.80. And 1.81. 1.91, 1.91 seconds. 1.83 seconds. 1.68 seconds. 2.31, 2.31. 1.87, 1.87. 1.78. 1.94, 1.94. 2.24, 2.24. 2.23. The final drill will take place from a distance of 25 yards. From here on the signal to fire, I'm going to fire one shot to the body. This simulates a situation where maybe you have a fleeting target and you only have one opportunity to try to fire one well-aimed shot to stop that hostile threat, potentially threatening someone other than yourself with imminent death or serious bodily harm. So I'm going to be firing one shot from this distance. I'll do that 3 times with each handgun. Once again, starting with the Derya. Let's see what happens. .35 seconds, 1.35 seconds. .21 seconds, 1.21. And 1.24 seconds. I really want to give the Derya Island pistol credit for this one for a 3-point shot, but there is just the tiniest bit of white between the edge of the shot hole and the line for the heart. So this is a 2-point, so 2, 4, and 3 for the center of the heart there makes it 7 points from that distance of 25 yards. .44, 1.44 seconds. I don't know if you noticed it, but the beep was awfully quick that time after I released it. .30 seconds. And 1.28. .61, 1.61. .47, 1.47. And 1.99. .83, 1.83. .55, 1.55. I knew that one didn't feel good. It doesn't look good either. 1.54. If nothing else, with that last shot, at least our bad guy will never dance the tango again, at least not well. All the shooting is now done and we are back in the shop to crunch some numbers. By the way, in case you can't tell by the fact that my clothes keep changing and my hair is now much shorter than it was at the beginning of the video, it has taken several days to produce what you've seen so far. Anyway, before we go on, I'm going to show you a final look at the target for each of the handguns used in this test, along with the preliminary numeric score. And these are preliminary scores because as of yet there's been no time penalty assessed. So here are the targets and the scores. When I was originally planning this video, I intended to come back from the range, show you the final adjusted scores, and then explain where each handgun finished in the final standings. But when I started looking at each drill and crunching the numbers, I thought the results were somewhat fascinating, And if you've stayed with me to this point, you're probably going to want to hear some of the breakdown from the individual drills. Now, if you're not interested in that and all you care about is how each handgun ranked at the end, then fast forward in the video to the point where you see a chart that says final standings at the bottom, and you'll be able to see exactly how things ended. For those of you who are still here, I'm going to be reviewing these drills in the same order in which I shot them out on the range, and I'm going to flash a copy of my chart up on the screen so it's easier for you to follow along as I cover this information during the discussion of each drill. When you look at the chart, across the very top you can see each of the handguns that was used during the course of this test, and in the column immediately below the handgun identification is the data that I recorded for each handgun on that drill. The times that you see listed are the total elapsed time from the signal to fire from my timer until I had fired out the shots that were required in that particular drill. The average time is the average of those 3 times. The raw score is the numeric score that I was able to achieve with the handgun on that drill. And the adjusted score is not the average time subtracted from the raw score. Rather, it is the 3 actual total elapsed times added together, and then that figure was subtracted from the raw score to get the total adjusted score. In this first drill from 5 yards, you recall that I was firing a single shot to the head on initiation of my shot timer. And the first thing that caught my attention when I started to look at these numbers is how little difference there is in the average times from the fastest to the slowest. In fact, there are only 13 100ths of a second difference from the fastest average time to the slowest average time. The second thing that caught my attention is the fact that the Walther P99AS actually had a faster average time than the Derya DY9 Island pistol. And I think this might be indicative of the fact that I'm still a little bit faster, particularly at closer ranges when it comes to gaining my target acquisition with mechanical sights than I am with an optic. But also, I think the fact that the Derya DY9 Island pistol having the slowest average time might reflect the fact that it was the very first one I shot that morning, and I still might not have been moving quite as fast then as I did later on with the other handguns. Still, with the average times being as close as they were, I think that it's all really a wash. I don't see enough difference in any of those average times to really be able to declare one was much faster than the other based on the trigger system that it was employing for the individual handgun on that drill. Moving over to the CZ P09C and the Ruger RXM, things get even closer. The average times for those are different only by 5 100ths of a second. And the score was almost the same. The Ruger RXM had a numeric score of 9, which was a perfect score for that stage. And the CZ P09C was hot on its heels with a numeric score of 8. And the P09C only missed the 3 zone of that target by a tiny bit. In fact, all of these shots from all 4 handguns were very, very close. The ones that were outside of the 3-point scoring area were just outside. There were no really bad shots from any of these handguns in this drill. When I figured the final standings, the Ruger RXM came in first. The CZ P09C was second. The Walther P99AS was third, and the Derya DY9 Island pistol was fourth. By the way, the fact that the CZ P09C came in second, I think is also significant. It was always either first or second in all of these drills, and there was only one stage after this one where it had another shot out of the 3-point zone of the target. And I'm going to discuss this more when I get to the end of the video and talk about the final standings and what I think I see going on here. On we go to the 7-yard stage, and recall in this stage I was firing the modified failure drill with 1 shot to the body and 1 shot to the head. And when I started to look at the average times for this stage, the first thing that caught my attention is the fact that the Derya DY9 Island pistol this time around had the fastest average time. In fact, it was the fastest by quite a bit. It was almost a full half a second faster on average than the CZ P09C. And I wondered when I looked at this if we're seeing the advantage of that heavy ported island barrel keeping the muzzle from rising quite as much on the Daria DY9 when I fire this drill and allowing me to fire that second follow-up shot faster than I was able to achieve with the other handguns that don't have the heavy ported barrel. The Walther P99AS this time around had the second fastest time, also indicating to me that I'm still able to acquire my target very quickly with those mechanical sights. It would have been interesting to see what the time for my first shot on target was between these two, to see if the difference really was in getting off a faster follow-up shot with the Daria pistol, or if I was in fact firing the first shot and the follow-up shot faster with the Island pistol than I was with the P99. Still, the P99 is performing very well, and the fact that it has the lowest numeric score on this stage, I think represents the fact that it is the only handgun that doesn't have an optic mounted, so I'm not able to shoot it with quite the same level of precision that I can fire the other handguns that do have an optic. Even so, I'm still getting my shots off very quickly, even though I have that first double action pull. And on this drill, I was managing the trigger transition between the shot to the body and the shot to the head. The CZ P09C had a perfect numeric score this time around, but as I said, the lowest average time. And the Ruger RXM had the third slowest average time and also the third lowest numeric score. Another thing that I think really stands out with regard to this particular drill is the fact that I had a headshot that went high with both the Walther P99AS and the Ruger RXM. So the trigger system that was employed, and keep in mind that's what I'm looking at in this video, really didn't make any difference whatsoever. That came down to the shooter, in this case my skill, and the fact that I screwed up. So whether we're looking at triggers or optics or whatever, everything always comes back to the individual shooter and that shooter's marksmanship and their ability to put shots effectively on target. When I calculated the final adjusted score for all the handguns in this drill, the Daria DY9 came in first. The CZ P09C came in second, and even though it had the slowest average time, it still came in second place, and that's because it had that perfect numeric score. So the accuracy that I'm getting with the P09C is quite good. The Ruger RXM came in third place, and the Walther P99AS came in fourth place. From 15 yards, I was firing 2 shots to the body, and from that distance, it's kind of deceiving because by the time you get to 15 yards, you really start to have to slow down a little bit and make sure you're squeezing off an accurate shot, or at least I do. And when I look at the average times to fire out those 2 shots from 15 yards, the Daria DY9 had an average time of 1.87 seconds. The Walther P99AS had 1.81 seconds. The CZ P09C had an average time of 1.99 seconds. And the Ruger RXM, interestingly enough, had the slowest average time of 2.14 seconds. But once again, from the fastest average time to the slowest average time is only just a little bit more than a quarter of a second. So still, we're seeing all of these handguns, regardless of what triggers they use, being very close in terms of their average times. The Walther P99AS, once again, had the fastest average time. And I think what's happening here is as I'm coming up on target, I am seeing those iron sights and I'm able to start my trigger press, and I'm getting those off just a little bit faster than I am with the Daria DY9 pistol, which had the second fastest average time, because with that pistol I have to take just an instant longer to make sure that I have the dot perfectly placed on the target before I start my trigger press. The CZ P09C had a score of, a numeric score that is, of 17 this time around. This is the second stage where it gave up 1 point. It had the second slowest average time, but still it was faster this time around than the Ruger RXM, and it had a higher numeric score by 3 points than the RXM. So the P09C is still performing very well as I move back farther and farther from the target. When I calculated the final adjusted scores, the CZ P09C was number 1, the Walther P99AS was number 2, so Consider that for a moment. The two handguns that both had a double action first shot trigger and had to have a trigger transition before firing the second shot, on this two-shot stage came in number 1 and number 2. The Derya DY9 came in number 3, and the Ruger RXM came in 4th place. The final stage was fired from a distance of 25 yards, and that required 1 shot to the body, and that drill was repeated twice for a total of 3 rounds from that distance from each handgun. And this time around again, when I look at the average times, the P99AS and the DY9 are just running neck and neck all the way through this entire test. The DY9 was the fastest once again, but the P99AS was only 7/100ths of a second behind it. And the DY9 was ahead by 1 point numerically at the end of this stage. But here again, I think that's more the advantage of the optic, especially as the range increases. And that's really, I think, as I said before, the biggest handicap for the P99 all the way through this drill. Has nothing to do with the trigger whatsoever, and just has to do with the fact that I can't place the shots as precisely with the P99 without an optic as I can with the other handguns that do have optics mounted. The P09C once again had a perfect score this time around. It also had the longest, or the slowest, I should say, average time once again. And the Ruger RXM had a score numerically of 7, and it had the second slowest average time. When I calculated the adjusted scores, the CZ P09 came in 1st place, the DY9 came in 2nd place, the Ruger RXM was 3rd place, and the Walther P99AS came in 4th place. We've now arrived at the portion of the video where I'm going to go over the final standings for all 4 of the handguns in this test. And in order to calculate the final standings, I first totaled the numeric score for each handgun in each stage. And the total score for the Derya DY9 Island pistol was 46. Total score for the P99AS was 43. The total score for the CZ P09C was 52, and the total score for the RXM was 46. I also totaled all of the elapsed time from each drill, and when I added those all together, that was the total time penalty for each handgun, and I subtracted that total time penalty from the total raw score to get the final adjusted score. And this is kind of amazing. The CZ P09C came in 1st place. And this handgun, wherever it is behind me here, has only been in my collection for a little over a week. In fact, the only time I shot it before this test was when I conducted my initial review of this pistol, and the only shooting that I had done to this point had been the shooting that I did in that video, so not a lot. Since that time, the only thing I've done to this handgun is dry fired the bejesus out of it in order to hopefully smooth out that double action pull just a little bit, and it seems to have worked. The double action pull does feel quite a bit smoother than it did when I first took it out of the box, and I've got about 2,000 dry fire cycles on it at this point. It's not any lighter than it was before, but it does feel smoother. And the fact that this handgun came in 1st place, I think, might solve a mystery that I've wondered about for quite a while. I'll get into that in just a moment after I finish going over the final standings. In 2nd place was the Derya DY9 Island pistol, and this one didn't surprise me. In fact, I thought this was going to be the handgun that would win because it does have the heavy ported barrel, it does have a very nice trigger, it shot very well throughout the course of the test, and the fact that it's 2nd place only surprises me because it's in 2nd place and not 1st place. Like I said, the real surprise during this test was the finish for the P09C. The Ruger RXM came in 3rd place, and I thought it might do I was expecting probably the DY9 to be 1st place and the Ruger RXM to be 2nd place, only because it doesn't have a ported barrel. But the RXM came in 3rd place, even though this is probably the handgun during the course of the last year that I've shot more than any other, because I've used it for so many optics reviews. Even so, it still did quite well. I had one bad shot with it on that failure drill where I put it more or less over the top of the head of the target. That was my fault, not the pistol's fault. Overall, it performed pretty well, but just not as well as the two higher placing finishers in this test. And in fourth place was the Walther P99 AS. And as I said several times when I was reviewing the individual drills, I think the biggest handicap for the P99 is the fact that it didn't have an optic. Particularly when I got to the greater and greater distances, I just was not able to place my shots with the same degree of precision, even though in terms of the average time for my drills, I was firing my shots. I think this was typically either the lowest average time or the second lowest average time. I'd have to go back through and double check again. And the times were so close anyway that I really don't think we can impart anything with regard to the double action first trigger pull and single action pull and trigger transition or anything like that as having a detrimental effect with either the P99AS or the P09C. There really just wasn't anything there that I can see when I look at the results of all these different drills that I can point to and say, okay, there is where that trigger really had a bad effect, and this is where it really slowed me down, or that's where it really impaired my ability to fire accurate shots. It just didn't happen. It all comes down to working with these handguns and actually learning to shoot them. The type of trigger doesn't matter that much. What matters is the shooter's ability to place shots with whatever trigger is installed on the handgun they're using. Now, I want to come back to the P09C for a moment and talk about something that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That's the fact that this has the slowest overall time. When I add all the times together, this had the slowest time. In fact, when I look at the results, when I totaled up all the elapsed time for all the drills, the total elapsed time for the P09C was, I think, the total difference in time came out to about 3 seconds. That's for all 4 drills, all the elapsed time, all of that. And this was definitely the highest total elapsed time of any of the handguns. The total elapsed time for the DY9, as you can see, is 17.59. For the Walther, right behind it, 18.16. Ruger was 20.25, and the P09C was 20.43. But I've noticed over the years, different times, shooting handguns with a double action trigger pull, a lot of times, if I have something that will shoot in both a double action mode and a single action mode, whether it's a semi-auto or a revolver, a lot of times when I'm shooting defensive type drills, I'll get a little better accuracy in double action mode than I get in single action mode. And I've wondered about that for a long time, and I finally have a theory as to what might be happening. Since it does take an extra few milliseconds in order to cycle the trigger in double action mode, the shooter has just a little bit more time. And you have to do something with that time while you're squeezing the trigger. And I think what at least a good shooter does is take those average few extra milliseconds to refine the sight picture, and then when the trigger breaks, the shooter is firing a more accurate shot than when they're firing in single action mode and they come up and they get that sight picture and they squeeze off the trigger that much faster. I think that's what's going on. I think it actually forces you to concentrate on the sights a little bit more when you're firing a double action shot than when you're firing a single action shot, and because of that added concentration, it's possible to fire more accurate shots many times in double action mode than the same shooter with the same handgun in single action mode. At least that's my working theory to this point. And that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward them to me. Remember, stop by my website, hrfunk.com, check out the news and information page, see all the latest things going on with me and the channel, and also go by to the products page, because a lot of the products I've reviewed here on the channel have links on that page, and there's information beneath some of those links that'll save you some money if you make a purchase. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.